New York, September, 30 CP Flash. Ambassador Holloway died here today. The end came suddenly, as the ambassador was alone in his study.
There is, something ungodly about these nightwire jobs. You sit up here on the top floor of a skyscraper and listen in to the whispers of a civilization. New York, London, Calcutta, Bombay, Singapore. They're your next-door neighbors. After the street lights go dim and the world has gone to sleep, along in the quiet hours between 2 and 4, the receiving operators doze over their sounders and the news comes in. Fires and disasters and suicides, murders, crowds, catastrophes. Sometimes an earthquake with a casualty list as long as your arm. The nightwire man takes it down almost in his sleep, picking it off on his typewriter with one finger. Once in a long time, you prick up your ears and listen. You've heard about someone you knew in Singapore, Halifax, or Paris long time ago. Maybe they've been promoted, but more probably they've been murdered or drowned. Perhaps they just decided to quit and took some bizarre way out. Maybe it's interesting enough to get in the news, but that doesn't happen often. Most of the time you sit and doze and tap on your typewriter and wish you were home in bed. Sometimes, though, queer things happen. One did the other night, and I haven't gone over it yet. I wish I could. You see, I handle the night manager's desk in a western seaport town. What the name is doesn't really matter. There is, or rather was, only one night operator in my staff, a fellow named John Morgan, about 40 years of age, I would say, and a sober, hard-working sort. He was one of the best operators I ever knew, what is known as a double man. That means he could handle 2 instruments at once and type the stories on different typewriters at the same time. He was one of the 3 men I ever knew who could do it consistently, hour after hour, and never make a mistake. Generally, we only used 1 wire a night, but sometimes when it was late and the news was coming fast, the Chicago and Denver stations would open a second wire, and then Morgan would do his stuff. He was a wizard, a mechanical, automatic wizard, which functioned marvelously, but was without imagination. On the night of the 16th, he complained of feeling tired. It was the first and last time I had ever heard him say a word about himself, and I had known him for 3 years. It was only 3 o'clock, and we were running only 1 wire. I was nodding over a report at my desk, and not paying much attention to him when he spoke. "Jim," he said, "does it feel close in here to you?" "Why, no, John," I answered, "but I'll open a window if you like." "Never mind," he said. "Reckon I'm just a little tired." That was all that was said, and I went on working. Every 10 minutes or so, I would walk over and take a pile of copy that had stacked up on neatly, as the messages were printed out in triplicate. It must have been 20 minutes after he spoke that I noticed that he had opened up the other wire and was using both typewriters. I thought it was a little unusual, as there was nothing hot coming in. On my next trip, I picked up the copy from both machines and took it back to my desk and sorted out the duplicates. The first wire was running out the usual sort of stuff, and I just looked over it hurriedly. Then I turned to the second pile of copy. I remember it particularly, because the story was from a town I had never heard of, Xebico. I saved a duplicate of it from our files.
Xebico, September 16th. CP Bulletin. The heaviest mist in the history of the city settled over the town at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. All traffic has stopped and the mist hangs like a pall over everything. Lights of ordinary intensity fail to pierce the fog, which is constantly growing heavier. Scientists here are unable to agree as to the case, and the local weather bureau states that the likes has never occurred before in the history of the city. At 7 p.m. last night, municipal authorities...
It must have been 15 minutes later that I went over for another batch of copy. Morgan was slumped down in his chair and had switched his green electric light shade so that the gleam missed his eyes and hit only the top of the two typewriters. Only the usual stuff was in the right-hand pile, but the left-hand batch carried another story from Xebico. All press dispatches come in takes, meaning that part of many different stories are strung along together, perhaps with a few paragraphs of each coming through at a time. The second story was marked, Add Fog. Here is the copy.
Add fog. At 7 p.m. the fog has increased noticeably. All lights were now invisible, and the town was shrouded in pitch darkness. As a peculiarity of the phenomenon, the fog is accompanied by a sickly odor, compared to nothing yet experienced here.
Below that, in customary press fashion, was the hour, 3:27, and the initials of the operator, J.M. There was only one story in the pile from the second wire. Here it is.
Second ad, Xebico fog. Accounts as to the origin of the mist differ greatly. Among the most unusual is that of the sexton of the local church, who groped his way to the headquarters in a hysterical condition and declared that the fog oriented in the village churchyard. It was first visible as a soft grey blanket clinching to the earth above the graves, he stated. Then it began to rise higher and higher. A subterranean breeze seemed to blow it in billions, which split up and then joined together again. Fog phantoms, riffing in anguish, twisted the myth into queer forms and figures, and then, in the very thick midst of the mass, something moved. I turned and ran from the accursed spot. Behind me I heard screams coming from the houses bordering on the graveyard. Although the sexton's story is generally discredited, a party is left to investigate. Immediately after telling his story, the sexton collapsed and is now in local hospital, unconscious.
Queer story, wasn't it? Not that we aren't used to it, for a lot of unusual stories come in here, over the wire. But for some reason or other, perhaps because it was so quiet that night, the report of the fog made a great impression on me. It was almost with a dread that I went over to the waiting piles of copy. Morgan did not move, and the only sound in the room was the tap-tap of the sounders. It was ominous, nerve-wracking. There was another story from Xebico in the pile of copy. I seized on it anxiously.